Bushman's hole is a death wish. It is almost 1000 feet deep. In fact, more people have walked on the moon than having explored and gotten to the bottom of this unfathomably deep sinkhole. It is that life-threatening. In today's story, two divers attempt to descend to this sinkhole's maximum depth, only to realize that they are simply not going to survive in it. It was truly a horrifying incident. So, I'm gonna tell you about it. Here is the story of the Bushman's Hole cave diving disaster. Bushman's Hole is a deep submerged freshwater sinkhole in the northern Cape province of South Africa. With a depth of over 900 feet, this is a body of water that no novice underwater diver can venture into and survive. A diver would have to descend for a very long time into the dark and endless abyss to get to the bottom. Now you might be wondering, who in the world would want to explore this sinkhole? Well, I can't answer that because I wouldn't explore it either myself. But Don, Shirley and Dave Shaw had their reasons. It all started in 2004 when they explored Bushman's Hole for the first time and came across the remains of a dead diver. You see, almost a decade ago on December 17th of 1994, a young man named Dion Dreyer from Johannesburg, South Africa was carrying out a practice dive with a team of technical divers in Bushman's Hole. The 20-year-old diver had been invited to team up with the South African Diving Organization and then was asked to join a particular dive reaching 492 feet in Bushman's Hole. On that ominous day, he ventured into the sinkhole, but unlike everybody else, he didn't make it back to the surface. His fellow dive buddies stated that he was lost during the ascent back to the surface. They believe during the ascent he either developed oxygen toxicity or hypercapnia. Both are fatal conditions. But again, one could argue that developing a condition like that mustn't be a surprise in a deep sinkhole like Bushman's Hole. Well, I think we all could agree with that. So later, Dion's parents hired divers left and right to retrieve their son's body, but not even the most pro rescue divers could find the corpse. There was no sign of it, only Dion's helmet was found. After countless attempts, the family gave up. They were devastated and eventually left after placing a plaque on a rock wall near the mouth of Bushman's Hole as a remembrance to their son. This tragedy also devastated the diving community, especially considering the fact that almost always when divers die underwater, their bodies get recovered. Sadly, Dion's case was different. He got lost and hidden in the Bushman's Hole for many years. Everybody gave up on discovering him. It was simply an impossible task. Ultimately, Dion's family and friends also accepted their loved one's tragic fate and decided to let him rest in the dark and deep Bushman's Hole. At least that is what they thought, until Dave and Don on that fateful day in October of 2004 explored the Bushman's Hole. The two divers had spent 9 hours and 40 minutes in their dive. During this long and exhausting exploration, Dave came across something, or rather you could say his light did. It was an old wetsuit filled with human remains, basically a bunch of bones. Dave instinctively swam towards it and took a good long look. He thought it makes total sense that rescue divers would abandon their recovery mission to find a corpse when it's lost at a depth like this. Right away it occurred to him who this was, the lost diver mentioned on the plaque near the entrance. So he quickly tried to pull the body free, but it was stuck in years of built-up mud and silt. It only elevated his heart rate, so he calmed down and stopped trying. Finding this body was not in their dive plan. Both divers knew if they tried, it would only put their lives at a risk. Running out of air and a number of health conditions would have been obvious consequences, so both divers left the body there feeling pretty upset. They kind of lost the one chance they had to take this diver's body back to the surface and finally let his family and friends find some peace with a proper funeral after all these years. But just because they failed doesn't mean they gave up on it. In fact, that whole ordeal gave the two divers a new purpose, a new mission to retrieve Dion one way or another. So once they returned to the surface that day, they immediately contacted Dion Dreyer's parents. The pair gave the news of the discovery of their son's remains. They said, "We are going to retrieve your son's body." Then the two almost immediately began planning the recovery operation. It was no ordinary dive. Their plan was to dive 900 feet. Every 33 feet down they dive, the riskiness they are exposed to practically doubles in Bushman's Hole. Even the air they breathe at such an incredible depth can lead their bodies to develop deadly health conditions. For example, if they breathe too much nitrogen, it could put their minds on a euphoric and drunk-like state where they would even forget they are underwater. They might even throw out their mouthpieces thinking they are on the surface. It is that dangerous. Also, another thing Dave and Don must keep in their minds is to never panic or breathe too heavily trying to free Dion's body. If they ever did, they could pass out and drown. Either way, they were bound to struggle a bit as the body is stuck in deep mud. Not only that, there is the elephant in the room, which is decompression sickness. You see, on the way back to the surface, the pair must not rush. They have to stop multiple times along the way for their bodies to release the gases they absorbed into their blood during the descent and the time spent at the bottom. If these gases, especially nitrogen, were not decompressed properly, they will form bubbles in their blood. Then they will block the blood flow and lead to a lot of fatal health conditions. 1. They might not be able to move due to joint and muscle pain. And 2. Also the worst case scenario, they could have heart failures or strokes. All in all, this decompression stops will add extra time to the overall dive. Another issue they will face is the pitch black darkness. This sinkhole is so large and deep that not even the most powerful flashlights are effective. If they shine the light any direction, it will disappear. The darkness will eat the light. Basically, the point is that diving into Bushman's hole is truly a death wish if you weren't prepared to deal with all these complications. This is exactly why Dave and Don spent a good amount of time planning. Unlike their previous dive where they explored around in the Bushman's hole, they are going to free and recover a body stuck in mud. For that, they had to use advanced equipment. You see, unlike for recreational diving, Dave and Don this time had to use a closed-circuit system. It includes rebreathers and some other gear that allows some or all of their breathing gas to be recycled. This is used in technical diving. It will help the two last long in the water with less air tanks. By less air tanks, I mean they still have to carry at least about 6 air tanks. Alright, now that you guys have an idea of the real gravity of a dive in Bushman's hole, I hope you guys understand the complexity of this recovery operation. So with that said, finally, the day of the notorious dive came. It was January 8th of 2005, a little over 2 months after their previous dive when they initially located Dion's body. For this dive though, they had next level pre-planning. They wanted to minimize the risk as much as possible. They had 35 backup air tanks placed in the water already. That is more than enough air for Don, Dave and even other supporting divers that get into water. Surviving a rebreather failure would have been easy with that many tanks. They also set up a winch system so that divers can be hauled on a stretcher up the cliffs of the sinkhole into a decompression chamber. Moreover, in case there were any medical emergencies, Don also recruited a doctor to stay standby. So after this extremely thorough preparation, they dropped the short line down into the depths of the hole. It was early morning, 6:15 AM to be specific. So Don and Dave along with their supporting divers entered the waters of the Bushman's hole. Dave set off first as he was the diver planned to go to the deepest of the cave and free Dion's body. Then after 14 minutes, Don followed behind. By this point, Dave should have gotten to Dion's body and even almost done with freeing it. So Don expected to meet Dave with Dion's body at their rendezvous point of 1725 feet. That is almost equivalent to the height of the Eiffel Tower. Now if the rendezvous point is that deep, imagine the bottom of the cave where Dave is at by this point. That takes a different kind of tolerance to fear of dying. But well, however, at around 500 feet during Don's descent, he saw Dave's light a couple hundred feet down, but it was remaining still. In fact, a little too still for a diver who's ascending with a dead body to a rendezvous point. You see, before the dive, Don asked Dave whether he's sure about going to the deepest of the hole alone. Dave then said yes, but if he ever wanted help, he would signal. In cave diving, when a diver flashes their light or waves it around, that normally means distress signal, or in other words, asking for help. But right now, the flash wasn't even moving. Also, Don didn't see any bubbles coming from Dave. They were very bad signs. He knew right away that something must have gone terribly wrong. By this point, it has been over 20 minutes. Don was confident that there was no room for any errors with the amount of planning and preparation they did. But he instinctively knew that Dave must need help despite him not showing any signals for help. Nonetheless, Don still thought to himself that Dave must be fine. But in reality, a motionless diver at the depth that Dave is at must always mean dead. Day before this dive, Dave said to Don and all other supporting divers that the most important person on this dive is you. If you have a problem, deal with your problem and forget about me. It's better to have one person dead than two. In fact, even Don himself said to everyone, if Dave doesn't make it back, if I don't make it back, we'll stay there. That's the end of the story. We don't want to be recovered. But well, Don never really would have expected such a scenario to really come true. But it is happening now. So against his own advice, he went to help Dave. He couldn't just leave his friend behind in the depths of a sinkhole. He at least wanted to see whether there was anything he could do to help. So Don descended past his planned depth and reached 833 feet. That was the deepest he had ever gone in a dive. Then he suddenly heard this intense cracking noise. It was his rebreather controller on his forearm. It had been exploded due to the fierce pressure at the incredible depth that he is at right now. Although this sounds like a terrifying thing to happen underwater, it wasn't a big deal to Don. He was trained to deal with these types of situations. He knew precisely what to do. He had to manually add oxygen to his gas mixture. When I said gas mixture, it means the type of gas used in this dive. In technical diving, divers use trimix air. It is a mix of oxygen, helium and nitrogen. Based on the depth of a dive, divers change the variation of these three gases so they can survive underwater for a certain period of time. Now, Don had to manually add oxygen to this mixture. However, there was a specific amount to add, but Don didn't know how much he was adding. In fact, he added too much, which became a really bad problem. So, he can no longer reach Dave. You see, when a diver descends past 180 feet and he is inhaling too much oxygen, it could lead to oxygen toxicity. It is a deadly condition that no diver would want to experience underwater. So now Dave is in grave danger. He had two choices. He could either try to reach Dave and most likely suffer the same fate, or he could attempt to save himself. He told himself, okay, Dave might make it back. He's either dead or he's working his way back. But all I could deal with right now is what is right in front of me. So he took the most sensible decision, which is to ascend and not die. But the problem now is that he can't ascend too quickly. He had to stop for decompression. Every minute he spent at this depth, a full hour of decompression time was added to the ascent. All in all, he had 10 hours of diving ahead of him by this point. The situation is getting much worse. The truth is that the chances of Don surviving is pretty damn low, considering all the complications he's facing. It didn't take too long for him to suffer from the effects of oxygen toxicity. He was feeling dizzy and started passing out. He lost all his senses. He had absolutely no sense of down, up, sideways or anything. To make matters worse, he lost the grip of his guideline. He kept passing out, waking up, passing out and waking up, swimming in these little circles, spinning around trying to find his guideline, because the line was Don's only ticket out of the sinkhole. At this depth, in pitch black darkness, he couldn't see even the little beams of light coming from the entrance. The only range of view was what is right in front of his flashlight. At this point, the only way he could survive is by luck. So finally, Don's light caught a hold of the guideline by complete accident. Yeah, he got lucky and quickly grabbed it, though he was almost unconscious while all this was happening. Then it got even worse. He started vomiting in between breaths. As an experienced diver, he kept calm though and eventually stabilized himself. After that, he gradually began ascending back towards the entrance. I'm telling you, that must have felt like a ride in hell. Nonetheless, after many painful hours, he got pretty close to the surface, where he also met up with one of the support divers. Using a waterproof pencil and a slate made for underwater communication, Don wrote, "I'm okay, and Dave's not coming back." No matter how hopeful and positive he wanted to be, he had to face the harsh reality. If Dave was ever alive, he would have gotten here by now. But he hasn't, Don thought to himself. He was exhausted that he couldn't even move, so the support diver quickly helped him make the last bit of the ascent. So finally, Don along with the support diver emerged from Bushman's hole after a 12.5-hour dive. It was 7 p.m. by this point. He was winched up the cliff face and right away put in the decompression chamber before being taken to a hospital in Johannesburg the next morning. Although Don did the impossible and survived, Dave didn't. He did not emerge from Bushman's hole that day. It was clear that he was dead. Don was treated for 2 weeks straight before he could think clearly to form a sentence. He suffered a great deal of physical and mental damage. His balance was impaired permanently, but here's what's truly surprising. After a few more months of recovery, he actually went cave diving again, almost like nothing happened. But as for Dave, well, we all know of his fate. A week after the incident, his body was found. It had floated up and discovered about 66 feet below the surface, stuck under an underwater ceiling. With Dave, there was a body bag entangled in a line. Inside it was Dion Dreyer. So ultimately, Dave actually completed his mission. He and Don recovered Dion's body and brought it back to the surface to his family. But sadly, in the process, Dave died. However, what happened to him remained a mystery until his last recorded video of the dive was uncovered. In it, there they were, Dave's final moments. So here's what has happened to him. First, Dave enters the hole. You can hear the short line squeak through his fingers as he slides down. About 11 minutes into the video, Dave reaches the bottom of the cave, more than 1.5 minutes earlier than planned. As soon as he hits the bottom, he gets to Dion and pulled out the body bag to get to work. Dave begins slipping the body bag over Dion's legs. As he is focused on doing that, he accidentally starts up quite a bit of silt. So Dave then waits for the water to clear up, and just like that it clears. When visibility becomes good, he sees Dion's body floating creepily in front of him. It seems Dion wasn't a complete skeletal as everyone had thought. Instead, the corpse had mummified into a soap-like composition that gives it mass and neutral buoyancy. The body was not supposed to float. Everybody theorized that it would have pinned to the ground, but now it is floating, which is a problem. Because when the body is constantly moving in the water, it is much more difficult to slip the body back over it. In the video, it is clear that Dave struggles and fumbles. He then lets out an audible grunt of effort. Dave is getting more and more distressed by the second as he begins breathing faster and louder. You can hear it in the video. This is when Dave should have left the body, but he doesn't. He is too determined to finish the job. Dave keeps trying to control the body, but what he does next made things 10 times worse. He lets go of his lie to use both hands. Dion keeps turning and rolling in front of him, resisting Dave's attempts to get him into the bag. This struggle goes on for about 2 minutes, and his line is seemingly everywhere. It snags on his light, and Dave pauses to clear it. Everything happening right now is just wrong. Dave is making fatal mistakes left and right. A cave diver must never let go of his gear. This was very uncharacteristic of Dave. Don, as he was watching the video, got super angry that Dave was doing the worst possible things in such a life and death kind of a situation. In this video, then it looks like Dave is acting confused. He is working at the height of his torso instead of his feet. His body movements are peculiar, as if he doesn't know what he is supposed to do. After about 4 minutes, Dave pulls out his scissors to try to cut away Dion's dive tanks as he slid the corpse into the bag. So miraculously it was done. Dion's in the body bag finally. But the real problem was only starting at this point. Dave's heart rate continues to increase and his breathing becomes even louder and faster. Then suddenly he loses his footing on the sloping bottom. He scrambles back to the body in a cloud of silt. The grunts of effort, despairing little bursts of sound are painfully frequent. Dave is suffering from extreme nitrogen narcosis. According to the support diver Peter, at this point, you only focus on one thing. You don't focus on the dive anymore. The one thing becomes everything. And I think with Dave it became the body, the body, the body. You can tell Dave has completely lost his senses in the video. His main focus was not to save himself, his focus was on what he is seeing right in front of him, Dion Dreyer's body. Finally though, out of sheer luck or whatever it was, Dave decides it's time to ascend now that Dion's body is in the bag. But right as he tries to swim up with the body bag, he snacks on something. Dave's moments become awkward and his breathing gets worse. His desperation is pretty apparent in this part of the video. What he got snagged on is Dion's dive tanks that are sitting at the bottom. He tries to escape but he just can't. He can't do anything at this point. Every breath he takes now sounds like a sharp grunt. Dave tries to swim up but gets anchored by the weight of Dion's body. He still had the scissors on his hand, so he tried cutting himself out of the entangled lines, but simply nothing happens. It looks like he cut something but nothing really gets cut. His heart rate keeps accelerating and he sounds like he's gasping. When John and Peter were watching this video, they literally turned the sound off. It was that painful for them to listen to it. Eventually, about 21 minutes into the ordeal, Dave passes out due to the high amounts of carbon dioxide in his lungs. At this point, it is clear he's dying. And just like that, about a minute later, there were no moments. Dave Shaw passed away. Nuno Gomez was one of the support divers with Don and Dave that day, and he's the last person alive today out of everyone of the group. He reminisced what it's like to dive in the Bushman's hole. He said Dave could have survived that day, but while you're in the depths of Bushman's hole, you don't think of a new plan even if it means getting to save yourself. It doesn't work like that. Your mind is clouded. You cannot do it. However, he clearly honors Dave. It was a noble dive that took a lot of courage. After all, he did complete his final task. He brought Dreyer's body back to the surface. But the question is, was it worth it? Well, I'll leave the answer to that question to you guys. But anyway, that brings us to the end of the story of Dave Shaw's final dive. If you like this kind of storytelling videos, you could consider subscribing. I would really appreciate that. Alright, with that said, thank you for watching, and with another story, I'll see you guys soon. Until then, stay safe out there and goodbye.